the rates of violent crime by half, not to mention for about 1/10 of what we currently spend on police, courts, and corrections. The secrets add to the importance as they identify ways to get change, to decrease violence and make us safer and more peaceful. How privileged are we today to have both science and the secrets exposed in person, and how privileged am I to make the introductions. Were I to outline the experiences and achievements which have led to Professor Waller's conclusions, I would still be here the day after tomorrow. In a nutshell then, 50 years of travel to 50 countries, keynote speeches and advice to governments, civil society, and international organizations. There's more. Professor Waller works in English, French, and Spanish, and he has contributed, amongst others, to the US National Criminal Justice Commission and South Africa's Task Force on Safety and Security in Mandela's time. Professor Waller's unrelenting focus throughout has been to end violent crime, as is witnessed by 3 recent books. They are titled Less Law, More Order, Rights for Victims of Crimes, and Smarter Crime Control. His approach, always science, always comparative knowledge, and always reason. There are more achievements. Through his contribution to the UN Magna Carta, Victim Magna Carta, he has, at the national level, helped to change policies, amongst others in Mexico, in Japan, and across Europe. At the international level, he has influenced how the International Criminal Court operates. And were this not enough, he has also and is also helping to change action and agendas at the global level. In that context, to focus on being preventive rather than reactive. And in both cases, about results to save lives, stop injuries, and trauma. As Suman Kana Agarwal puts in her book, The Science of Peace, it has been said that nonviolence is not an emotion, sentiment, feeling. It is a science like any science, with a distinct body of knowledge. It has to be learned. Only if you have learned it can you apply it. The same applies to ending violent crime. Professor Waller has learned it, and we are delighted that we will learn more today about how he is applying it. For those who have not read his book, Science and Secrets of Ending Violent Crime, I highly recommend it. His style is accessible, his content a blend of science and humanity. There are the facts and figures one would normally expect from a serious analysis, descriptions of the problems and solutions, not just theoretical, but also practical, and significantly, also showing where the money could come from to pay for it all. Then for me, there is the surprising element in a work of science, a visceral feel for the blood, guts, and grief of the victims. Here's just one example as Professor Waller introduces us to a single victim through the last poem this poet will ever write. The poem is dedicated to his murdered son. It begins, "The world is no longer worthy of words. They suffocated them within as they suffocated you, as they tore apart your lungs, and the pain does not leave me." Through Professor Waller's book, you are viscerally introduced to the pain of victims and their frustration because obvious solutions are being ignored. Hope lies in Professor Waller's data, detailed yet accessible, and excellently laid out for practical reference. Unfortunately, as Professor Waller says, science and making it accessible is not enough. The challenge at hand is how to tackle putting effective solutions into practice to end violent crime. The guidelines are clearly laid out, including an excellent chapter about the successes achieved by early adopters. Now all we need is one, for decision makers to be smarter and put these effective solutions into practice to end violent crime, and for the rest of us to be smarter in making it happen. In the meantime, I can no longer wait to hear from the only one who can do this subject matter justice in person. Please join me in welcoming Professor Waller.
Thank you, Evelyn. That's quite an introduction. I'm not sure where this guy actually is, but anyhow, thank you so much. You've laid out quite a bit of what I want to talk about. The Sustainable Development Goals that the UN, that were adopted by every government in the world, every state in the world in 2015, have 3 SDGs that really interest me. 5.2 about reducing violence against women and girls. 16.1 homicides. 16.2 children. If you look at the background paper, you will see that there are 500,000 people murdered every year, which a surprisingly small proportion, as has been mentioned earlier, are actually killed in wars. Very small proportion. If we look at the estimates of the number of women who are the victims of sexual assault, we're looking at something around 250 million. You have to remember that there are 1 million women every year who are the victims of sexual assault, rape, in simple terms, in the US every year. The Americans are very good at statistics. If you look at children, we're talking roughly 1 billion. I'm going to move in a moment to Canada because I think it's the easiest way for you to really understand how we can actually reduce those horrible victimizations by 50% within the next 5 years in Canada and by 2030 across the world. I believe the SDGs are the secret to making it happen, and SDG 17, which is how you actually get stuff implemented, is important. And yes, COVID has set us back. And those of you who followed the General Assembly last week, or this week, know that things are not going well. But I think they can be turned around. I think they must be turned around. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about how we're trying to turn around those things in Canada. So Andrew, the first short video.
I'm not doing this for me. I am partly doing this for Gabriel, but really I'm doing it for change, for the one word change. This has to stop. I feel like we can do better. We need to start talking about violence, but the root causes of violence. I know it comes down to the social determinants of health. It's not an easy solution. We're not talking about adding more police force. Mm-hmm. I'm not talking about locking people up. We're talking about what are the root causes? Why is this happening? Why is a person homeless? Why is a person not being able to access care, access supports?
So some of you may have seen that interview about 3 days after Gabriel, her son, was stabbed to death on a Toronto Transit Commission station. And she actually is more typical than you think. Something around 70 to 75% of the mothers of children who are murdered want prevention. They want prevention. They want it stopped for other people. They want change. They want people to tackle the causes using our knowledge. Yes, there are people who want punishment, who want the traditional system, and they just want whatever the state can do. They want to go to execution chambers and watch them, the murderer of their son executed in the United States. In the United States. But most don't actually want that. But they don't want a system where we don't use our knowledge to stop things. So I'm now going to show you in a moment a 2-minute video, which is different from the one that was on the website, which was one that it was a 2-minute video we used at the UN. I chose to use our 2-minute video that we're using at the moment with city councillors. This has been shown to city councillors in Vancouver, in the Victoria and the Victoria area, in Edmonton. Something like this was shown to city councillors in Montreal, and we're actually going to be doing a presentation of the French version to a range of city councillors in Montreal. We've also used it with the Premier of British Columbia. We've offered to brief the new public safety minister, and we think that this is one of the secrets to get change. Previous speaker told you about amazing innovations. He didn't mention that the world has been changed by social media, by cell phones. Everybody sits there, and I'm glad you're not doing it at the moment, with their cell phone in front of them, watching something. 2 minutes may be a lot, but at least you can watch this 2 minutes on your cell phone. And your attention span, even for politicians, may actually run to 2 minutes. I'm talking about national and provincial politicians, as well as municipal politicians. So let's just watch this video. You're not going to be able to read all the slides. Don't worry. I'm going to tell you what those slides tell you in more detail in a moment. So Andrew, the 2 minutes.
Violent crime harms more than 1 in 15 people each year in Canada.
Prevention focused on the root causes of violent crime is proven to reduce violence significantly, cost-effectively, and within 5 years.
Social outreach to those most vulnerable prevents violence.
Youth development programs in high-violence neighborhoods prevents violence.
Trauma therapy and mentoring with job training and sports prevents violence.
Positive parenting and addressing negative social norms prevents violence.
Governments in Canada must commit to preventing violence with a violence reduction office, sustained investment, and strong planners.
Cities that plan smartly can and have reduced violence by 50% or more within a few years. To have violence in 5 years, Canada must invest now in 3 new ways to harness proven solutions.
Establish a high-level office for violence prevention to lead change and achieve less violence.
Train community safety planners, develop safety planning tools, and foster learning from success.
Invest sustained funding in smart prevention that is adequate to achieve significant reductions. We have the knowledge and practice to save lives, stop trauma, and help people feel safe from crime. Thoughts and prayers are not enough. We deserve smart and affordable investments in violence prevention now to end violent crime.
So if we can move to the PowerPoint slides. So that was produced by 2 people who are 2 generations younger than me. One finishing a PhD at Carleton, and one who works for the Canadian Municipal Network for Crime Prevention. So she does the main training that is beginning to go viral from coast to coast, even if you've not heard of it, to develop community safety plans in rural and urban areas in in Canada. And of course, we had no money to produce that, but I think it does get a simple message across. By the way, I don't think Biden had seen this video. As you may know, Kamala Harris has just been appointed to the Office for Gun Violence Prevention in Washington. Kamala Harris has a title of a book similar to mine, Smarter Crime Control is mine. And she was the Attorney General of California before becoming the Vice President, and now she heads up this office. We would like to see, and we've been advocating for an office for victim support and violence prevention. It's more than guns in Canada. At the federal level, we would like to see it in all provinces, and we would like to see it in every city. So we will see. There are actually 7 US states now that have an office like that, but they've got a long, long way to go. So we've got a long way to go with my presentation. I hope it won't feel too long. So here's the conclusion. Basically, we need 2 things to cut violence by 50%. At the bottom there in white, we have to do the things that are known to work. These things, like the earlier first speaker this morning said, are highly cost effective. He was talking about renewable energy. It's a lot cheaper than adding police officers who respond to crime as crime goes up. We want the violence stopped by smart investments based on what works, assessed in terms of whether we're getting results. And the little video mentioned 4 things, and I will be talking about them more, and they're in this summary slide. At the top of this, in blue, are accelerators. The UN Sustainable Goals, yes, it has Sustainable Goal 17, which is about implementation, but they talk about accelerators. They don't talk only about what works. They talk about how we go from what is possible to what actually happens. And those accelerators are incredibly important. The federal government, for a fraction of what they're spending on RCMP or corrections or even on projects, could be accelerating the shift from reacting Band-Aids, and they're not nice Band-Aids. Whatever the police persuade you, it is not nice to be arrested, whether you need to be arrested or not. It's not nice to sit for many months on remand in the local jail. This is the worst time in any young man's life who's arrested. These are not nice things. They may be necessary. But if we're going to change, as Gabrielle's mother said, if we're going to change to things that actually stop violence, then we've got to invest in the accelerators. And these talk about violence reduction unit. Kamala Harris, the model. City of London in England, the mayor has an office. Glasgow that reduced violence by 50%. I'm going to be talking about these. Bogota that reduced violence by 50%. They all had an office like that. We have to train people to do it. It's come up with some of the previous speakers. You can't take somebody who manages the transit system, particularly in Ottawa, and then move them into community safety and expect them to do it right. You have to train those people. And yes, you're in the building with criminology, but they're not teaching people to actually use the knowledge. You have to actually help them know how to implement it. And they have to have experience doing it. And they have to be able to measure the results. So the third one is you have to be able to measure results. The fourth one is raising awareness. Social media. Yes, traditional media. We've been very lucky to see op-eds published in most of the major Canadian newspapers. We've also been lucky to see the Glasgow model written up in the Star and in La Presse. And the Glasgow model resumes a lot of what we need to do in order to reduce violence. So if you want to see change, you have to get out there. And yes, there's a famous op-ed written by Roy and Susan on the climate crisis. It has a stronger word in it, but we have to get regular coverage of these issues in the traditional media and particularly on social media. You may or may not like Elon Musk. I know he's now the richest guy in the world, and he's taken over Twitter, and you may say, well, you know, what you going to do with it? The fact is that this is one of the major ways of communicating both with politicians and the public. That's how people get elected. So if we want to see change, we have to get to know how to use Twitter. Yeah, or LinkedIn, or maybe Instagram, or whatever becomes the next social media, probably not Facebook, but social media is a very powerful change agent. It raises awareness about what actually happens. This city, they did a police survey, a survey of the public. Do you want more police or not? Well, you know, if you're not one of the ones who's getting picked up by the police, you probably want more police. But they didn't say, well, do you want more police officers or do you want less crime? Which is actually the question they should have asked. So we have to raise awareness, and yes, we have to raise awareness of politicians, but politicians in many ways are reactive, or they can get the information from those violence reduction units. So it was mentioned, I always have to have a slide on the UN Declaration. This is actually a cartoon from 1981 in The Citizen, and it says it all. We have a system that ignores victims. Whether it's good or bad for the accused, it ignores victims. So we have to start thinking about victims. There are many, many more victims and families than there are offenders. I'm not saying that we totally change what happens to offenders. We can come back to that maybe at Q&A, but the system is not about doing something for victims. And until we start doing that, we're going to get more policing in Canada and more prisons in the United States, and we're going to get more violence, particularly in Latin America, South Africa, and other countries. So this is actually a highlight of that declaration. It's cited, for instance, when the Harper government set up an office for victims of crime, which was good. It's cited in the International Criminal Court, where the victims actually have some rights, because the French negotiated those rights. And it's had an influence, not so much in the US, because we really took some of what was going on in the US into that declaration, but everywhere else in the world who has anything at all for victims, it comes from that. So I'm not about to commit suicide or become alcoholic. I can change the world, and I'm not saying that I'm that powerful. I mean, I didn't do it on my own, but when you get together with other people and you focus on a particular way of making it happen, the UN is very important, then you can make a difference. And this is going on, and 85, I can't count the number of years, that's almost 40 years ago. It's still having influence today. So what the UN adopts may have a slow influence. I sort of woke up the next morning after it was adopted and expected everything to happen, but it takes time, but it's a very important way of achieving success. So I've talked about the SDGs a little bit. I'm a fan, not so much of what their targets are. None of this is about punishment. It's about getting results, less victims. It's about making places safer. I've just come back from a 2-day peace meeting in Mexico, which was all about how you reduce interpersonal violence, because they have astronomical levels of violence. And it's about how do we change so that we have half of the 500,000 homicides is achievable still before 2030. So I just wanted to show you that I'm not the only person who sends out this message. Daniela Ligiero, who works in primarily in East Africa, Together for Girls. If you have a moment, you should go and hear her pitch to Guterres, the Secretary General of the UN. And basically what she says is, we have the knowledge, it's possible. Well, that's good. Fabulous that she makes that statement. But you actually have to do more to go from what is possible to real reductions. She's talking about the 1 billion children every year who are the victims of violence. She has a particular focus on sexual assault. She, by the way, uses surveys from the CDC to measure real levels of sexual violence against girls in schools and adult females. The Americans have developed CDC, Center for Disease Control and Prevention, its full name isn't often known, has actually a great survey. Mexico has a good survey. We don't yet have a good survey. But actually having data makes a difference. So the book, Evelyn did a fantastic job of telling you why it's such a wonderful book. I just remember the pain, but anyhow, I'm going to have to use her statements. So it's basically 3 things. The science, and I have to give you a little bit of the science. I'll actually go quite fast through it because it isn't my main message. The guidelines, the essential for making what is possible happen, the actual, how do you do it? And then the secrets of how you actually get the change. And I think this is really important when we're talking about the environment. I don't know whether it's important when we're talking about war. I don't know anything about it, but I've been listening to the speakers today. But getting buy-in and believing that you can get buy-in is so important to the changes that we need. So just some quick things. There's an incredible dividend from stopping violence if you're in the United States. If you cut violence by 50%, you would get roughly $40 billion a year in savings because you wouldn't need those prisons. And you may say, well, in the United States, it can never do this. Well, Connecticut, New York State have reduced incarceration by more than 50%. Why? They reduce violence by 50%. And if you reduce violence by 50%, you automatically empty prisons. I don't know if any of you go skiing in northern New York State, but that's where they build their prisons, and these are all empty. So the guards now, some of them are able to retire, but I guess they have to go and work in ski resorts or something because there are no jobs. There's some good news. Why does Canada have such reasonable rates of violence, meaning we're above any significant Western European country like France or Germany or England? It doesn't have to be the Scandinavian countries. Well, we are above them. We're about double their homicide rates, so they're not that good. But hey, we've got the United States. They produce handguns so that the people who are deprived and poor and young men can go out and shoot each other because they get angry and they want to trade drugs. It really is as simple as that. And Chicago, great place to visit, as long as you stay in the nice places. Don't wander into the not so nice places. You may get hit in crossfire. They have 2.5 times the number of cops of Toronto, and they're paid roughly the same. And of course, they have an incarceration rate about 6 times, and they have 10 times the number of homicides. So yeah, having, like the mother of Gabrielle said, reasonable social policy, like China, for instance, which hasn't been talked about too much, or like most Western European countries, you don't have a lot of violence. You don't have a lot of need to get a gun. It's actually incredibly easy to get a gun in Canada. You just have to have a buddy with a drone, and they're practiced because they've been sending drugs across for a long time, and now they can send handguns. Unfortunately, it's handguns they send, not AR-15s. Because AR-15s, they actually show, but handguns, you can hide them. So if you're looking at street violence in Toronto or Montreal or even here, these are handguns. If you're looking at domestic violence, then these are long guns. And of course, where do they come from? They come from the United States. Long guns come legally, handguns come largely illegally. So homicide is actually going up, but somebody was talking to me about the long-term trends on homicide. The long-term trends on violence that are going down from, I don't know, 10th century to today. Yeah, but hey, this is 2023, as our previous speaker showed us. We have everything now. I mean, incredible levels of education and healthcare and all these things. It is just straight stupid to say that we're a less violent culture. We could be less violent if we chose to do it. And this is going back up. Should we be alarmist about it? No, we're not about to be New York City or Chicago or New Orleans or Mexico City or whatever place you want to choose, but it is going up. And policing, when I was in government in the 70s, the one thing we wanted to avoid was unionization of policing. Well, we've got unionized policing. They're very good at their job. We now have the RCMP now has a union, got a 20% increase. Policing is now very expensive. Whether you like or dislike policing, it is very expensive. And there are much, much better ways of responding to mental health calls and particularly stopping violence and doing anything at all about violence against women than policing. And it's time for our police leaders to actually, like cardiologists and the Heart Institute, promote prevention. Police leaders should be promoting prevention, particularly if they know what works, and some of them do. Not all, but some of them do. We need the policing organizations to come out in favor of prevention. So just a comment about regional rates. Latin America, much higher rates than anywhere else, and they're getting worse. But don't forget South Africa. Don't forget Nigeria. So it's not just Mexico and Brazil and Central America. I did a presentation to the Costa Rican National Assembly recently. They have doubled their homicide rates in the last year or so. Why? We don't really know, but a lot of this has to do with the demand for fentanyl in the United States. And you basically have a free trade agreement between Mexico and the United States. We'll give you guns if you give us drugs. And the impact of that on other countries like Mexico, I mean, it's tragic in Mexico at the moment when you don't do the things that work. So these are just some Mexican statistics. I think the most important thing there is we could save 15,000 lives a year. I think the civilian deaths in the Ukraine-Russian war are around 11,000, 12,000. But anyhow, it's roughly the same order. So just think easily, this is doable. The only resistance to doing this is a police prison industrial complex that is driven by police unions and a desire not to change. And it's not just the police, it's the people engaged in the criminal law process. If it was actually in a civil law process, we might see something different happen. So, data, if you actually reduced violence in Mexico by 50%, you would generate about 5% of the GDP. So this has a very important economic payoff. And if you generate GDP, then you can talk about the wonderful things that they have in China and Canada and England. Healthcare, schools, peaceful communities, jobs. So this is really important. And if our politicians aren't concerned about poorer people getting killed or women getting violated, then maybe they can take an interest in the economic dividend. So I'm going to go through these quite quickly. It's most of the homicides across the world are young men killing young men who live more or less in the same area. The ones who actually do the killing or disproportionately involved in violence have a series of strikes against them. They are not the average kid in the poor area. They're not the average kid in Jane Finch. They're a particular subgroup who you have to focus on. And this is a map of Winnipeg, but I could show you a map of Mexico City. I actually flew in a helicopter over Mexico City on one of my speeches, and I said to the guy, I can tell you exactly what the crime levels are in the areas, and I did, and he said, well, how do you know? I said, well, this is basic. You look at the poor areas, that's where the violence is worse. You look at poor areas next door to a middle class areas, that's where the property crime is worse. And the rich areas, particularly in Latin America, all have private security. I mean, the wives may have been moved to the United States, but they have protection. So, yeah, it's a very small group of people who you have to focus on. That's people, family, who you have to focus on. Now, this is a pretty chart that comes from Ontario. And Ontario is actually very interesting. So they actually started looking at prevention about 10 years ago. 5 years later, they produced examples of prevention in Ontario. It was actually all nonsense, but there were one or two things that worked. And then just before the Liberals went out of power, they came up with a community safety guide, community safety. And this is taken from the guide. And it basically says, the red thing is what we do now. We spend a lot of money responding after the fact. And risk intervention is police referring to services, but the services have to be there, which they probably aren't. And then the green is social development. You reduce poverty and educate people. This is actually what most people talk about as being violence prevention, and it's good, but it takes a long time and it's very expensive. The blue is what gives you the short-term results. So these are a series of websites that any of you could go on your cell phone. Please don't here. And if you did, you would see there are lots of things that have been proven to work. You'd say, okay, yeah, but this is too much for you to use to actually identify what happens. So, so one of these, by the way, is WHO. Another one is for Washington State Parliament or whatever it's called. So what I did in the book was I looked at all those things and actually a whole lot of other things, because at one time I was a competent researcher that did my due diligence and homework, and then we made it all simple at the end of the chapter. So you go through what has worked in policing, what's worked with youth, what's worked to reduce violence against women, and you give a conclusion. So I'm going to give you some examples of those conclusions. This is more complicated, but these are basically what you can do about property crime. And I just want you to look at the focused deterrence. This is actually what the Biden administration has been doing in the United States. So you call these young men in, you say, if you do this again, we're going to arrest you. And you say, there's a nice social worker over there, and their mothers talk about them. It's good, but it's in the United States. So if you do connect with the social worker, you get good results. But if you don't, you go to prison. And prison gives you, it's like a fridge, it gives you short-term protection, and then you come out. But unlike fruit that's been in the fridge, you are worse off afterwards. So, and in the United States, you can't get a driving license, don't have a wife, which is really important, by the way. A wife and kid are a good way of reducing violence. So it looks good, but it's not where I would start in Canada. These are things that were mentioned in the video. This gives you a 65% reduction in arrests. By the way, you can go on Public Safety Canada's website. I guess you don't have to go there to see their website, and you can see this program. So it's not just me promoting this program. And the British government also promotes this program, and I'm going to show you in a moment another slide. What is this? This is youth outreach. You have street workers. Actually, in this city, at the bottom of Hog's Back, there's an old fire station, and they set up a youth center there that is similar. But of course, they didn't measure it. I think it's still going, but you have to get the bad kids to come in. So you have to have outreach to get that. Where do the bad kids come from? Their mother sends them, their school sends them, maybe the police send them, or you outreach to them, and it works. 65% reduction. Hey. This one is now being implemented in Toronto and Montreal. Basically, you take a victim of any sort of violence, gun violence or whatever, and you have a social worker reach out to them because they suddenly find that they're not going to live forever. And it hurts to be stabbed or shot. And yeah, you want to get the guy who did it, but you can be persuaded that you might think. This is a Canadian invention, Stop Now and Plan. And this is, somebody was talking about brains. This is about rewiring young men before they turn to the responsible age of 12. So between 8 and 12, you work with them to help them deal with anger, rage. And I just look at what works. This gives you a 33% reduction. And of course, that reduction lasts over many years. So this is a very important way of reducing violence. They get recognition in the United States, in Florida of all places. Hey, we should be doing this in this city and from coast to coast. You've got to do it enough to get a different, you can't have one little project that takes 100 kids. You've got to do this in a larger scale. Now, those sources of what works are the result of random controlled trials. So you take, as they did in Ypsilanti, Michigan, you take 100 kids on a waiting list for enriched childcare, you pick at random 50, and then you give them enriched childcare, help their parents, and then you compare them over time. And that's how we have the confidence that these things work. The Youth Inclusion Program was a national program. It wasn't a random controlled trial. So that's even more powerful than the random controlled trials. But that's how we know that they work. This is from Public Safety Canada. I guess Mendocino never saw this. I don't know whether the new minister has seen it, but this is from their website. It's in my book. And basically, it shows you that if you do the SNAP program, if you do the YIP program, and you do a family program with a complicated name, multisystemic therapy, then you reduce the need for police and prisons. What it doesn't show you is how much you reduce the actual levels of violence, but that's how you get the savings in police and so on. So here is a very strong argument for investing and accelerating the investments. I'm just worried a little bit about time. I think I'm a little bit over, right? Okay. So we've developed a safety monitor tool for provincial and municipal politicians. You don't need to look at it in detail. This is just a tool. If you were a city councillor, this is how you could check whether your city's doing the right thing. This is about planning, and this is about the essentials for planning. So I'm going to show you very quickly Bogota. Bogota in the 90s had one of those offices for violence reduction, like Kamala Harris is going to head federally, and this planned how they were going to reduce violence. And the office said, reduce alcohol between these hours, get the guns from people by giving them nice shoes, and do the stuff in hospitals. And then over 10 years, you get a 50% reduction. Hey, if Bogota can do that, we can do that in your favorite city, Toronto, Montreal, Ottawa, wherever you want to go. And by the way, if you can do it in Bogota, you can do it in Mexico City. You can do it in Rio de Janeiro. You can do it in Cape Town. So this is very relevant. Now, Glasgow cloned Bogota and got a 50% reduction within 3 years. So we don't have to wait 10 years because we've learned that we can do these things better. Now, a number of cities, London is cloning Glasgow, doesn't know it's cloning Bogota. I think they'd be embarrassed, but they are in fact cloning Bogota. Toronto, wow. If you think we can't change the world, look at the mayor election in Toronto. Look at Olivia Chow elected against a police chief, by the way, not a particularly competent police chief. So she's now the mayor. And her first speech about the woman, 40 or so, mother of two who was killed in crossfire, was about all this stuff. I don't know exactly how they got it, but I suspect my wife. And she is making the right statements to make these things happen. We'll have to see if she gets provincial money, which she will need, and whether she will get federal money. I'm actually quite hopeful that they will get provincial money. There are rumblings. I get calls from people who you would be surprised, not Doug Ford, but I get calls from people who can actually make a difference. So Mayor Boston has already promised a 20% reduction in shootings and homicides within 3 years. Well, she's a smart politician. She's under-promising. She brought in people to negotiate with communities what they were going to do, the sorts of things that I've talked about. They're going to do them. They will get a 50% reduction if they do it reasonably well. Well, under-promise, overachieve, that's good. We'll see. Newark probably of less interest to you, but they are doing really well too. So people think that Canada, the United States, Mexico, all they want is punishment. This is just not true. The only people who want the punishment thing are the same people who want to produce more oil. These are the status quo, policing, Courts, largely. Correction system, less in Canada, but very much in the United States. And they want punishment. They want punishment because they make money out of it, and getting the change is harder. This is not what the public wants. They don't want defunding policing because they think you're actually going to take away a safety line. So don't use defund policing, just do the things that actually work. So I do want to take 2 minutes on this one, and then we're on the final slide. So what do I think are the secrets to accelerating? So what can I do as an individual other than have two younger colleagues who can know how to actually use a cell phone and who know how to produce things on Canva? Well, yes, they are the ones who are going to change our world in Canada, and actually the world in other places like Mexico. Social media is incredibly important, an incredible way. It's free. Well, maybe Elon Musk is going to ask you soon for $5 or something. You'll make the first 3 months free, and then you're stuck with this for life. But, you know, even at $5 a month, this is still an incredible deal in terms of getting a message across, a simple message. And yes, the traditional media are also important. The Star has done editorials basically plagiarizing our stuff. Wow. And they've done coverage of Glasgow, for instance, and some other things. I'm retired. I don't have any, like some of the other people here, I only have 50% days if I'm lucky, and I don't have any money to spend on these things. So these things can be done on low budgets. Maybe you can do better on bigger budgets, but you don't need big budgets. So on here, and they're also on my website. My website has the text for the video, are some videos that you can use, examples of a petition we did about a year ago, and a number of things that you can use in social media to change opinion. And if you want the Gabriel's mother's video, the link to it, it's all there. We've prepared it. But there's a catch to this. And the catch is this. So you've heard me talk about some things that work. I don't expect you to know all those things, but I hope you now know that from my latest book, you can get the information on what works. And if you have that information and you want to make the place safer, less violent, then you need to take some sort of action. And we have a police services board in Ottawa and everywhere in Ontario that you can talk to. And the new chair of that listen to you. She'll give you more than the 3 minutes and a prepared text that was left over from the Watson years. So you can do delegations. Every city in Ontario has a community safety well-being plan in progress and in process, and they're not good. They need improving. And this is spreading virally. You don't see it happening, but it's going from coast to coast. There is really a movement now towards tackling the causes and risk factors, but it needs encouragement. It needs encouragement. And yes, at the provincial level, it's important that the provincial government gets this, because that's where the main money will come from. And the federal government needs to move beyond projects, and they need to get the accelerators. Now, what I've said about Canada, I've used because you can make a difference internationally. Canada supposedly supports the Sustainable Development Goals. But do we? Are we really doing the things that where there's a lever to make a difference? And that's the importance. It doesn't matter whether we're actually funding programs for women and girls in South Sudan or in Tanzania or wherever. The real thing is to invest in those, in SDG 17, in accelerators, to train people who can do the planning, who can collect the data, who can use that to influence what is going on. My book was actually written for the Inter-American Development Bank. They asked me to look at the Spanish translation of what works. And I said, well, nobody in the US has ever used that. Why would you translate it into Spanish? And the guy looked at me and we started a conversation. And basically the conclusion from that conversation was, yes, we're going to translate it into Spanish, but we have to find a way of educating the people behind the politicians or underneath the politicians, alongside the politicians. So you make the proposals that are irrefutable. You know, the dollars, the public opinion, all those sorts of things. So we can really make a difference to violence across the world if we can get the Canadian government to actually take on reducing violence on children and women, which sticks with current priorities, in a way that's smart. 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 Remember, Kamala Harris's book was on smarter crime control, and I have a book on smarter crime control. But I hope I've explained some of the secrets of actually making the world a safer place in a relatively short time for an affordable way. And remember, accelerators, levers, ways to change the culture. So thank you for staying awake so late in the afternoon, and I'm happy to debate this or whatever Evelyn also wants to debate.
Well, first of all, I have a question for the audience. Yes, my question to the audience is, now do you recognize the speaker I introduced? Because he didn't recognize himself. Well, I have actually a question in the Q&A from a young man in Uganda. So it's a very general question, and perhaps I'll go to that first. He is saying, what can be done to convince youth in bigger numbers to participate in opportunities that can be put in place to help them not to engage in violence? So I was wondering, Professor Waller, whether you could take some of the information that you were talking about and, given your own experience in Africa and elsewhere, would you have any practical hints for a young man engaged in peace building in Uganda?
Well, I talked about the youth inclusion program, youth outreach. Some of the research on that comes from developing countries. I'm not aware of one in Africa, but in the Caribbean. So that is definitely a way forward, some way of youth outreach to those drifting into violence. There's also a program called SASA, S-A-S-A, that is one of the programs that I used in my book to illustrate what can be done about intimate partner violence. So this is basically a program for organizing communities, and it was tested in, I think in Tanzania, not Uganda, but in that area of the world. And it was tested by the World Health Organization. So they looked at two communities, one where this is done and one where this isn't. But it always comes back to how can you persuade the overseas development agencies. Yeah, CEDA or GAC or whatever it's called today is not a major player, but because they can fund levers, they can become major players. And that's what they need to do. Projects are great, but they're projects. If you're going to get something across a country, you have to invest as well in the accelerators. So this is incredibly important. And yes, you need to train people from the country. You give this guy a scholarship, and Yorkville University, which is a private university in Canada, was the only Canadian university talking at the UNGA last week. And they are going to be developing, they haven't announced it yet, so it may not happen, but they are very interested in a program to train those community safety planners. And the Canadian Municipal Network already has some trainers. Audrey Monette, who's the female voice, is a very good trainer, but we're not giving them enough money to do the training. So you have to give them adequate money. This is not gazillion dollars, but you do need to have more than just an envelope on the side. I want to use the question, Evelyn, just to, I talked to Evelyn yesterday because I wasn't going to get the joy of actually meeting her today, and was talking to somebody in the audience about the, I'm going to call it the Gacaca process. So Rwanda, a genocide, 1 million people killed, 1 million women raped, whatever it is, numbers roughly like that. They tried the traditional criminal justice system, and you just can't process them. I mean, imagine suddenly 1 million offenders. I mean, we can't process what goes on here. We accumulate all these people on remand because the courts are so slow, and of course they don't give justice to victims because it's all about the state against the offender, with victims having no role other than possibly a witness. So what is Gacaca? First of all, how do you spell it? Well, G-A-C, like in French, A-C as in French, A. And what is it? So you take a little village in Rwanda where some of the most horrible things that I will not go into happen. And you bring the guy from prison, or guys who were involved in this. And it's an open court. You have to have 50 people from the village. You have to have a little group of 7, one of whom can actually read and write. 7 are sort of executive. They have to follow some rules. But the rules are pretty minimal. Everybody can talk, but they have to take their turn. They have to listen. So they say what they think the guy did, and then the guy can respond, and you can have a conversation. But you have to be listening to the other person. And what is the end result? The end result is it's a truth-seeking process, not like the TRC in South Africa. This is a genuine truth-seeking process, and not like our courts, our criminal courts. So you get some truth, and then you get an option for the guy involved in this to offer some sort of restitution, whatever your particular phrase is. And that's how they're dealing with a genocide. I was sitting on a bus in about a month ago. I do a lot of stuff in Mexico and high violence places. And the guy next to me, I'd missed his presentation, and he was in charge of a Gacaca process, they didn't use that word, in Colombia. So between the paramilitary and, you know, of the violence in Colombia. And part of the peace agreement is a process identical to Gacaca. Well, it's not identical. I don't know whether they have 7 people. They probably have many more people who can read and write. I don't know. But the whole idea of truth-seeking, of actually getting to what happened. I come from a very strong victim perspective, and victims want to know what happened, and they want to know that the person who did it admits to it and recognizes what they did and the harm that was done. That's not our process here. So that's what they're doing. And I don't know exactly the nature of the restitution in Colombia, you have somebody talking, I think, tomorrow or sometime soon. In Rwanda, it was fairly simple. It was, okay, I'll give you my 2 cows, or I'll build your house for you, or I'll work on your small agricultural plot. Now, in Rwanda, there was also what I call a Wiedergutmachen. So there was a payment by the state to try and improve the situation of Tutsis in the villages where most of the violence happened. And you go back to the Second World War, and I've listened to the 2 speakers before, but one of the most important things that was not mentioned is the Wiedergutmachen. So Germany set up a system basically to pay development money to Jews and other groups who were impacted by the Nazi regime. And in Germany, you pay a tax towards the Wiedergutmachen. And in school, you learn about the Wiedergutmachen. Yeah, Germany's not perfect, just as we're not perfect. You do get the odd incident, but this is a fantastic way to educate people about what has gone wrong. So stuff in schools, Wiedergutmachen. I don't think in Germany you can do exactly what has happened in Rwanda, what's happening in Colombia. But I think these are very important examples to be thinking about. The International Criminal Court, Evelyn said I was involved with. I wasn't actually involved with it. They used the declaration, and they actually took paragraphs that we drafted here in Ottawa before it was adopted by the UN, and it's in the Statute of Rome. And those things basically give rights to victims. And the French wanted that. The Canadians didn't. They want a classic system where the rights of the offenders are fully protected. Well, the rights of the offenders are fully protected in the Statute of Rome, and the penalties are limited, but there are also help for victims. From the moment you go to argue that there's a case and the case gets accepted, you're protected. You may not be protected as well as I would like, but you're protected. This is incredibly important. And so different from the International Tribunal in Rwanda, where you took some guy, a young girl out of a village in a big car with a military policeman who drove you. They'd never been in a car before. They put you in a plane and they took you to Arusha, and then they put you in a hotel room next door to the guy who had a Canadian defense lawyer because he'd been living in Canada. I mean, you see how quickly you can change once you have basic principles like in that declaration. So, and maybe the International Criminal Court isn't working perfectly, but if you made a lot of money in whatever country you were doing these horrible things, then that money can go into a trust fund, which can compensate the victims. It can also be used for peace building. Good stuff.
Okay. Thank you. I'm wondering if there are questions from the floor. Otherwise, I do have another question. And before I get to that, a shout out for people in East Africa who speak Swahili. They do not say they go to a meeting to discuss things. They say they go to a meeting kusikilizana, which means to hear each other. So by definition, hearing each other is the reason for meeting with anybody. I thought that was a nice parallel to what you were saying. And now, perhaps I'll go with my question. You have obviously done a lot of work on proactive prevention, and as you say in your book, the main issue, the most effective and cost-effective ways to deal with crime and victimization is upstream, targeted, proactive policing and social development. I would like to ask if you could draw this from the individual crime to peace building, and are there any parallels that one can draw to scale up what you've done for crime prevention into war prevention, peace building?
Well, the first speaker this morning said that if he didn't know the answer, he would say so. And I don't see, I do see some parallels, but the parallels are more the importance of looking upstream to what can be done. So I think when you look at the curriculum in German schools, that is a great way to go. And I think not just on war, but also on the environment. So Susan, my wife, was involved in Learning for a Sustainable Future. It is so important for everybody at the school level to be learning about what can be done about the environment. And, you know, Rita Thunberg is absolutely wonderful, but I think it has to be complemented by stuff that goes on in schools. And I would actually like to see a radical change in universities, to have a radical change. One course, hello, how can a university like this one not afford one compulsory course on some of the most essential things in their education? So what are the essential things that they aren't taught about? Well, let's start with the major killer in that age, which is drunk driving. Let's talk about mental health and depression. Let's talk about gender-based violence. We know any university, any college should have a compulsory program on bystander intervention, which is the most proven one, but basically every person, not just women. I mean, this would have to include the stereotypical engineering students, and wherever they are would have to go through a bystander intervention course, and they would have to pass it. It's not, they would have to pass, and if they don't, they have to go back. So I'm not sure what I've mentioned, and you could add peace building to that. You can certainly include active listening. And these are essential skills that we're a country with a very high level of university educated people growing up. So we need to take advantage of that. And yes, this should happen in schools. My book talks about 4th R, so reading, writing, and arithmetic are what schools do. And the 4th R is responsibility. I forget what it actually stands for, but 4th R is the name of a program that reduces sexual violence in schools around grade 10, 11 by 50%. Hey, yeah, we've improved sex education a bit in our Ontario schools, but this is a program developed by the University of Western Ontario. It should be in every school. How do we know that it's reduced? Well, you do a survey, you take 22 schools, 11 schools you do it, 11 schools you don't, and before you start, you do a survey of both boys and girls, and then after you've done it, you do a survey on boys and girls, and wow, the rates of self-report by boys and the rates for girls go down. This is what we should be doing. And the bystander intervention, I haven't explained all of it. I think in Frosh Week, you can go to it if you want, but it doesn't. It's great if people go to it who want, but it's the people who don't want who actually need to go. And I would actually like to see universities giving people a discount on registration if they've taken something like fourth hour before. And they can take the exam, and if they pass it, then they can get a credit on there. Because the people who get away with intimate partner sexual violence are the ones who become repetitive, and they're the ones that you need to get at.
Thank you very much. And I believe, Roy, there's a question from the floor.
Or from Roy.
Or from Roy.
I actually have a question I'd like to raise, Irvin. That was an excellent presentation. Thank you very much for your insights and your inspiration. The question I have builds on the question that Evelyn just asked, and it relates to one of the preoccupations of this conference, the role of the military in fostering war rather than peace. I mean, huge military complexes or wars waiting to happen, right? So just extending that line of thought to the domestic scene, have you, in your work, have you uncovered evidence that would suggest that countries with larger militaries, military complexes, have higher incidence of crime? And if so, is that due to some kind of culture which is spawned by having large military complexes? So anyway, it's just a thought that tries to link what you've said to what we're trying to do in the conference.
So I don't think there's a correlation. So I'm not sure which countries have the biggest military industrial complex, but I assume the United States is one of those, and the United States does have much higher homicide rates than Canada, who has higher homicide rates than Germany or England, and much, much higher rates than Japan. So you could begin to see a correlation. But then, I mean, China is much more peaceful than the United States. So, and I assume it has a big military industrial complex. Russia clearly has a big industrial complex, and its levels of homicide are not the same as you see. I don't recall exactly how they compare with the United States. The United States nationally is at about 6, so they will be higher than that. But if you look at Mexico, which is 24 per 100,000, I think Russia is somewhere around there. China is much, much lower. I don't see that as the key issue. The organization of the prison industry in the United States clearly is a factor. And the previous speaker showed you slides of military equipment that was given to local police stations after 9/11 to help them fight terrorists. I don't think it makes a difference. These are not a good way of reducing violence. They do, it means you can have a SWAT team go in, but you don't, there's no real reason that they're in any way correlated. I mean, and in the United States, what gets the headlines are the AR-15s, where a bunch of people get killed. These are surprisingly don't account for, I think they account for about 1,000 of the 23,000 homicides each year in the United States. So although they get a lot of publicity and they're using military weapons, AR-15s, I don't see this as correlated. But in Mexico, they are now using the military. So they moved the police into defense. By the way, France has one of their 2 major police agencies are in defense. And if you go to a tourist resort, you will see the presence of Marines, supposedly the non-corruptible military part of Mexico. So, yeah, I mean, if the United States spent less on the military, would they actually spend more on healthcare and jobs and the things that reduce violence? I don't know. In Mexico, they don't really need to engage in external war. And they have a socialist president who has not succeeded in reducing violence, unlike the previous one who did for a time before they stopped doing it. But the thinking that having more armed police, heavily armed police on the street makes people feel safer, in my view, is flawed. Maybe, why do we need these people when, you know, I come from a peaceful country like Canada, and they certainly don't stop the violence. You just, if you're going to rape, typically violence against women is behind closed doors anyhow. But if you're not going to do those things behind closed doors, you don't do it in front of a guy with a gun.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Evelyn Manfred has a question.
I'm sorry?
Manfred has a question.
Oh, Manfred, please. Thank you.
Irving, thank you so much for a really interesting presentation. I have a couple of questions of clarification and one comment. You started with a slide that put very helpful emphasis on focus on victims. But in a sense, as Evelyn has even suggested, virtually the entire presentation is in fact about focus on, well, not actually focus on perpetrators, focus on potential perpetrators, which it's not a contradiction, but I just was interested in that combination. In what way do you see everything that you're presenting as being primarily focused on victims? I can see one can make that distinction. The second is the 35%, this was a rough estimate from the graph that was put up. As I saw, a 35% increase in violent crime, I think it was Ontario, from between 2014 and 2021, struck me as pretty dramatic. And I wondered whether you had some way of putting that in context, given the discussion where, you know, I had the sense that we were making some progress with all these research findings and improving the way we deal with these things, which leads me to the final point. I was kind of surprised that homelessness didn't explicitly come into the discussion. I'm seeing it, I mean, even in this city, it's getting to a stage where it's just soul destroying to see the armies of people on the street. And to me, it's so obvious that the moment you don't have a home anymore, the moment you don't have a place where you can close the door and get your bearings, you will find it very difficult to be a sane person and a good citizen in so many respects. So how would you integrate that into the story? Because there's always the danger that the promise that one can fix these things with sort of fairly cheap, quick interventions might be, I'm not asserting that, but might be actually create a situation where one is discounting larger underlying factors that are really driving this whole process. And maybe I'll finish by saying that when you ask what can the Canadian government do better in helping other societies to deal with this? Well, my comment there would be the first thing they should do is stop giving technical advice, persuading countries to change their laws to be more friendly to foreign investors, which is in fact the framework within most of which the aid is given in line with the international agencies, because that is dramatically undermining the capacity of those countries to deal with these problems.
So Manfred, even though I'm a couple of years younger than you, I'm not sure that I can retain also all your questions so brilliantly. So I'll try. So our current system is about punishing offenders. The focus is on arresting a criminal court that, if you look at the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, where the rights of accused people and of convicted people are protected. So that's what all the energy is about. And that cartoon showed that, and then showed the victim gets nothing. So I'm interested in reducing harm to victims. I think the indicator of success is fewer victims. It may have involved perpetrators to have the victims, but it's a focus on reducing injuries, trauma, loss of life, and the more general public, a loss of feelings of safety. And that is dramatically different from the way we operate at the moment. So it doesn't talk about clearance rates. It doesn't talk about convictions. It doesn't talk about, there's a book coming out on October 3rd, the indictment of this system, because it so mangles victims through the whole process. So that's the answer to your first question. The statistic is actually national, and it's the violence indicator, so it's what gets recorded by the police. You have to remember that most victims don't report to the police, but so the more serious tend to get reported. If you have insurance, which you don't have for violent crime, but for property crime, you go to the police. So yes, it's increasing, but you have to look over a long period where it's come right down, and now, yeah, it's going back up, and over 10 years. I don't know whether it's 35%, but that doesn't surprise me. If you look at the Toronto serious crime indicators, it's something like that. Yeah, I think we should be concerned. But the problem with that is you get people who aren't actually interested in victims, who will use the victims as an excuse to get more votes because they're going to be so punitive, and this is somehow going to give the illusion that people are going to be safer. They're not going to be safer. Because actually the conviction rate, well, the catch rate is not that good, and the conviction rate isn't that good. You have to commit a lot of offenses before you start getting arrested. In homicide, it's different. But even on homicides, you don't get you get much better in Ontario than in Toronto than you get in Chicago. So I think we should be concerned, but not by trying to pretend that yes, that tough on crime. And I think this is important. There's tough on crime and there's tough on causes. I'm actually smart on crime. And I think you see a sort of NDP conservative split that is, you know, conservatives are going to be tough on crime, NDP is going to be tough on causes, even though they're actually the main reason why the police are costing us so much. And I'm not saying the Liberals are smart on crime, but we need smart on crime. And if you're looking at Mexico, if you're looking at South Africa, looking wherever you want, we need smart on crime. Now I'm thrashing around for your third question.
Maybe
okay.
just in the interest of time.
I simplified the presentation by talking about community safety plans. They're actually community safety and well-being plans, although the name of the change is community safety. So those are looking at drug overdoses, homelessness, as well as crime. But when you're talking about homicides, homelessness is not relevant. Drug trafficking is, and it's complicated. I didn't say don't think about homelessness or drugs. You do need to look at those, but they have slightly different solutions from what I talked about.
Thank you very much. And
No.
I'm sorry, I think now, unfortunately, the time is up. We've benefited enormously. And I think basically Professor Waller's books are the summary of this particular session. Less law, more order, rights for victims of crimes, smarter crime control, and effective crime prevention based on the science and secrets of ending violent crime. He's given us the tools for implementation, and I think we need to all do our bit. First, to thank him for the information, and then to put some of those incredible tools into practice as individuals and as countries. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you,
Me, folks, to bring our day to a close. Thank you, Evelyn, for your closing remarks, and thanks to all three brilliant speakers we've had. We've been treated to incredible wealth of information, analysis, and insight, and it falls to us to try and pull this together into a series of key messages and recommendations to government. Easier than it sounds, but anyway, that is our task. We look forward tomorrow to panels on Northern Ireland, Colombia, and Africa to see what kinds of insights we can get from research, data, and policy on those very different countries or regions. And we will take forward the conference from there on Thursday and Friday. Thanks to you all for staying with us throughout the day. I hope you have enjoyed today's proceedings as much as I have. And I look forward to seeing you not in person, unfortunately, but online for the remainder of the conference. Thanks again. Take care.
As you wrap up, and I'll play the last song for the day, written by Eric Bogle, Scottish-born Australian, and you'll recognize this from Vietnam War response. And it's called, the band played Waltzing Matilda.
Thank you.
Oh yes, Grateful We're Not Dead, sung by Don White. So have a good evening.
When I was a young man, I carried my pack, and I lived the free life of a rover. From the Murray's Green Basin to the dusty outback, I waltzed my Matilda all over. But in 1915, my country said, son, it's time to stop rambling, for there's work to be done. And they gave me a tin hat, and they gave me a gun, and they sent me off to the war. And the band played Waltzing Matilda as we sailed away from the quay. And amid all the tears, flag waving and cheers, we sailed all for Gallipoli. How well I remember that terrible day, how our blood stained the sand and the water, and of how in the hell that they call Solva Bay, we were butchered like lambs at the slaughter. Johnny Turkey was waiting, he primed himself well, he showered us with bullets and he rained us with shell, and in 5 minutes flat he'd blown us all to hell. Nearly blew us right back to Australia. But the band played Waltzing Matilda when we stopped to bury our slain. We buried ours and the Turks buried theirs. Then we we started all over again. Now those who were living just tried to survive in a mad world of blood, death, and fire. And for 10 weary weeks I kept myself alive, though around me the corpses piled higher. And a big turkey shell knocked me arse overhead, and when I awoke in my hospital bed and saw what it had done, how I wished I were dead. Never knew there were worse things than dying. For no more I'll go waltzing Matilda all around the green bush far and near. For to hump tent and pegs a man needs both legs. No more waltzing Matilda for me. So now every April I sit on my porch and I watch the parade pass before me. I see my old comrades, how proudly they march, renewing the dreams of past glory. I see the old men all tired, stiff and sore, those poor lonely heroes from a forgotten war. And the young people ask, what are they marching for? And I ask myself the same question. And the band played Waltzing Matilda, and the old men still answer the call. But year after year our numbers get fewer. Someday no one will march at all. Waltzing Matilda, waltzing Matilda, who'll come a waltzing Matilda with me? And their ghosts can be heard as they pass by